Good morning, everyone. I'm Jennifer Jansen, Communications Director at Airlines for Europe. And on behalf of all my colleagues with us today, I'm honored to welcome you to the launch of Europe's flagship sustainability initiative, Destination 2050. A warm welcome also to all of you who are tuning in via our live stream as well. Today is a proud and historic day for many of us in European aviation. We continue to struggle with the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic. And just to be clear, European aviation is currently experiencing its worst crisis in its modern history. But nevertheless, our willingness to come together as a sector and launch this flagship roadmap and flagship initiative together with our commitments shows just how determined we are to achieve our net zero CO2 emissions mission by 2050. Before I introduce our first speaker, just a few housekeeping rules for journalists on the call today. We will take all of your questions at the end of the presentation. So if you have a question, please send it through via the chat. Please send it through via the Q&A and not via the chat. And we will get to as many of those questions as possible. Please, when you write your question in the Q&A, indicate your name and who your question is for, and we'll get to those as soon as we can. I'd now like to begin our presentation by showing you this short film. I'd now like to begin our presentation by introducing our first speaker, Montserrat Barriga, Director General from European Regions Airline Association, ERA. Montserrat, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Jennifer. Good morning, everyone. I think we're going to share a presentation. Yeah, thank you. So thank you very much for taking part in the briefing today. We're delighted to be here. Our 5 associations, A4E, ACI, Europe, ASD, ERA, and CANSO, representing the entire spectrum of European aviation. We're very, very pleased to present our flagship sustainability initiative, Destination 2050, a route to net zero European aviation. NLR and CO have supported us with this new and independent scientific report to provide a vision and a path for meaningful CO2 emission reduction efforts in Europe and globally. I'd like to start by giving some perspective to this piece of work. We're all aware that the expansion of aviation, particularly during the last 30 years, has brought numerous benefits to Europe and its citizens. Air transport has provided us all with opportunities to travel, visit countries, communities, facilitating the swift transportation of goods across continents, and enabling society to progress. During the last decade, passenger traffic has enjoyed remarkable growth until 2019, before the start of the COVID-19 crisis in March, reaching 11.1 million movements in the 44 European countries of the ECAC area. High levels of healthy competition in Europe have allowed aviation to provide affordable connectivity, thanks to modern and efficient fleets, in ensuring the most sustainable model of commercial aviation today. Europe travel and tourism industry, as well as any businesses in Europe, rely on aviation to provide affordable flights for their customers to keep their local economies alive. However, this success model and the role of aviation and its environmental impact are now the subject of greater inspection, especially in relation to our carbon emissions. Climate change is one of the most serious issues affecting the world and is a key focus politically as well as for the public, traveling public, and most particularly future travels and the younger generations. The Paris Agreement and the UN IPCC have set up clear objectives and the limit of 1.5% to the global warming, and it requires net zero by 2050. Commission President von der Leyen has said that making Europe the first climate neutral continent will be the greatest challenge and opportunity of our times, and therefore her Commission #1 priority as laid out in the European Green Deal. We are all responsible for our impact on the environment, and we, aviation industry, take these commitments very, very, very seriously. In this sense, our 5 associations, joined by 20 more, recently launched the Roundtable Report of the Recovery of European Aviation. This report calls for an urgent EU pact for sustainable aviation, stressing the importance of a sector recovery that is fully compatible with broader efforts to reduce our industry emissions, provided the right supporting policies and financing framework are in place. It is fundamental to get the balance right between the environmental, social, and economic aspects. We cannot simply do this alone, so we have asked the EU leaders to join the pact by the end of this year, 2021. This report, Destination 2050, takes a further step in this direction and develops a set of commitments which are our industry's contribution to the EU Pact for Sustainable Aviation. Next slide, please. Thank you. So, in summary, Destination 2050 forecasts net CO2 emissions from intra-European flights reduced by 55% by 2030 below the 1990 levels, and all flights within and departing the EU, the UK and EFTA together realizing net zero CO2 emissions by 2050. All these achieved through a combination of measures across 4 pillars, which will be outlined by my colleagues in the presentation today. This slide shows the contribution from each pillar. So in summary, improvements in aircraft and engine technologies, both kerosene and hydrogen, could achieve emission reductions by 37%. SAF, sustainable aviation fuels, could reduce emissions by 34%. Implementing economic measures, 8%. Improvements in air traffic management and aircraft operations could achieve further reduction, 6%. The report also assumes an additional impact on demand from these measures, and it also assumes that European air traffic numbers will continue to grow on average by approximately 1.4% per year until 2050, without compromising our sector's ability to reach net zero CO2 emissions by this point. I now like to give the floor to my colleagues who will develop all these further. Thank you, Jennifer.
Thanks, Montserrat. And I'd now like to introduce Elizabeth van der Sman. Elizabeth is one of the lead authors on this report, together with NLR, the Royal Netherlands Aeronautical, together with SEO. And Elizabeth, I'd now invite you to take the floor and give our viewers a bit more background on the scope and the methodology that you undertook for this report. Thanks, Elizabeth.
Thank you, Jennifer. On behalf of the research and consulting team of NLR and SEO, I'm pleased to introduce to you the scope, approach, and methodology used in the project. To start with the scope, we looked at all commercial flights departing from airports in the EU+. This means all flights within Europe and all flights departing Europe to other continents in the world. And the EU+ is defined as the European Union, the United Kingdom, and the European Free Trade Association. While acknowledging that aviation is also responsible for non-CO2 climate impacts, the scope of this study is a quantitative assessment of CO2 emissions from all flights within scope. We started the project in September 2019 with an extensive literature review of all sustainability measures. We then conducted one-on-one interviews with experts from both member organizations and external organizations. We combined and collected all the information and performed a first analysis, which we completed in the summer of 2020. However, we found it important to include the recent COVID-19 impact on the aviation sector in our analysis. And we also found it important to include the most recent publications following the European Green Deal and European Hydrogen Strategy. So we included publication on hydrogen-powered aircraft, which were also published in the summer of 2020. This led to a final analysis, which we completed by the end of last year. And now, today, we are very pleased that we launched the Destination 2050 report. Next slide, please. So to explain the approach that we took, I will walk you through the slide from left to right. So starting with our base year, which is 2018, we looked at a flight schedule and passenger demand. And based on that, we then calculated the CO2 emissions. For our reference scenario, which is shown in the middle of the slide, we used a traffic forecast at individual route level. This forecast is based on Eurocontrol's challenges of growth and the Airbus Global Market Forecast to estimate flight schedules and passenger demand in 2030 and 2050. We also included the recent COVID-19 crisis, which indicates that passenger traffic does not return to pre-crisis levels before 2024. We then computed the CO2 emissions in the reference scenario, which is a hypothetical no-action growth scenario. This allowed us to assess the full extent of the sustainability measures that can be taken to reduce emissions. The sustainability measures are considered in 4 pillars. The first is aircraft and engine technology. The second is air traffic management and operations. The third, sustainable aviation fuels. And the fourth is economic measures. The combination of these measures influences both the flight schedule and the passenger demand, because the combined cost of these sustainability measures is modeled to impact ticket prices, resulting in a lower demand for air travel compared to the reference scenario. And of course, these measures are all analyzed to assess what substantial CO2 emission reductions can be achieved. Next slide, please. Now I'd like to walk you through the methodology that we used. So we defined the measures in combination with policies and actions. And to do this, we reviewed over 400 publications, both from industry, but also from universities, research organizations, and nonprofit organizations, to get a very broad view of all the options that are available to reduce emissions. Then we interviewed one-on-one many experts from the member organizations, as shown below, but also external parties, like, for example, from the sustainable aviation fuel industry. We combined all these views and organized a full-day workshop to discuss with experts. In multiple rounds of feedback, we collected additional input from our members. Next slide, please. This all led to the roadmap that we present today. I would like to stress that it is a pathway to net zero CO2 emissions in 2050. It means that it is based on the current knowledge, but that it provides a well-supported foundation for tackling the climate challenge. By analyzing different views from conservative to more radical ideas, we then combine this into what we believe as realistic expectations of future developments. Of course, when looking 30 years ahead in time, we have to acknowledge uncertainties. However, we believe that uncertainties should not lead to inaction, specifically not in the field of climate change, where action is required in the years to come. So therefore, we hope that this roadmap will provide guidance for government and industry. Thank you very much, Jennifer, and I'd like to give the word back to you.
Thanks, Elizabeth. Indeed, I'd now like to pass the floor to Vincent Dufuy, Director, Civil Aviation at the Aerospace and Defense Industries Association of Europe, ASD, to take us through one of the first pillars of the report. Vincent, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you. So maybe the next slide first. So I will detail the impact of aircraft and engine technology on our roadmap. Actually, towards the 2050 goals, aircraft and engine technology is the most important pillar because it will result in a total of 37% reduction in CO2 emissions, plus an additional 1% due to the impact on demand. And that corresponds to 111 million tons of CO2, which will be reduced. In order to get there, next slide, please. The industry, of course, needs to work on different pathways. There is not a single pathway to get there in terms of technology. So we need to work on, first of all, improvements to the existing aircraft and engine technology. And by 2035, this will result in 30% less fuel consumption and hence also less CO2 emissions. These improvements to existing aircraft technology are also important for the sustainable aviation fuels, because if you burn less fuel, you will also burn less sustainable aviation fuel. And this will be detailed later on, the SAFs. Secondly, the industry will also work on hydrogen-powered aircraft suitable for short-range intra-European routes, and they should become available by 2035. Those aircraft have the potential to reduce CO2 emissions by 100% once these aircraft enter into service progressively. And lastly, also the development of fuel-efficient aircraft and engines and optimized range and capacity for hybrid electric and electric regional aircraft and rotorcraft will reduce CO2 emissions for this type of aircraft by 50% compared to 2018. Those rotorcraft and regional aircraft will enter into service between 2030 and 35. Next slide, please. Now, in order for this to happen, of course, we need to start now in terms of research and innovation, because when the aircraft has to enter into service in 2035, it means technology needs to be ready by 2027 to 2030 so that the aircraft can at the end be certified. And that is also important to mention, that in order for the aircraft to be certified in new types of novel technologies, we need efficient and new certification procedures to be available. So that means it's also important that, for example, the European Aviation Safety Agency gets involved early into the research projects so that they get familiar with the new technologies, and that this will help to smoothen the later certification projects of this aircraft. Finally, we are of course working on future technologies. We should not forget that we can also have earlier benefits in terms of CO2 reduction. So fleet renewals based on existing state-of-the-art products will continue to reduce CO2 emissions in the short term, and even higher reductions could be achieved in the short term by accelerated fleet renewal, for which we need support in terms of government support from COVID recovery funds. Next slide. So what does this all mean in terms of asks for the policymakers and actions which needs to be done by the industry? As I explained, the industry will develop more energy efficient aircraft and bring this into operation through continued fleet renewal. The industry will also develop hydrogen-powered and hybrid electric aircraft, and also improvements to existing technology, and supporting airport and heliport infrastructure. For this to happen, we need support from the European Union, but also from the national governments, because they should stimulate those further developments and deployment of innovations by funding research programs and promoting carbon removal technologies. In this respect, it's very important that civil aviation research gets prioritized both at European and national levels through increased funding for example, the Clean Aviation and CESAR research programs in Europe. European and national governments should also support industry investments through incentives or by reducing the risk through a consistent and stable policy framework. So we need continuous support, and this support should not be reduced because of, for example, austerity measures. We need continuous support for funding these activities. We are ready to fund all parts of the roadmap, so we also want the European authorities to do the same. And then finally, a word as well. It's a European roadmap, of course, but European aerospace industry is a very important exporter on global markets. So we believe by working in Europe on those technologies, we will also benefit the world, because these technologies, of course, could also be implemented on the rest of the world's markets. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Vincent, for your presentation. And I would now like to pass the floor to Tanya Grobatek. Tanya is the Director of European Affairs for the Civil Air Navigation Services Organization, known as CONSO. Tanya, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Jennifer. Can we move to the next slide? Improvement in ATM and aircraft operations are estimated to be able to make an important contribution of 6% to reduction of CO2 emissions. Most of this reduction is focused on short to medium term. Next slide, please. The identified improvements are identified in 3 categories: airline operation, air traffic management, ground operations, and airports. So let me start first with airline operations. Identified improvements can be done in flight planning and execution. It's about using newer flight planning softwares as well as improvement flight management system envisioned to enter market in 2024. The second aspect is weight reduction. Now that has already, many airlines has already started reducing the weight, because the bigger the weight, the more fuel you burn. As well as aircraft condition and monitoring and maintenance, which is about clean engines more often, as well as exterior. The cleaner engine, the less, the better they work, the less CO2 they produce. The second category is airspace and air traffic management. In this category concerns the design and use of airspace in which airlines conduct their flights. A major improvement potential in Europe in terms of air traffic management is the realization of single European sky. The dedicated research program, CES ATM Research, future I will relate to that as a CESA, is regarded as an enabler for realizing the CES. So one is the policy, another one is the research or technology that can enable this. Now, historically, states have complete and executive sovereignty over airspace above that territory. As such, airspace and air traffic management have historically been national affairs. Therefore, many aspects of ATM improvement do not depend only on air navigation providers, but also on political will by government to make the necessary compromises regarding organization of the airspace. And in that category also come utilization of the, for example, military airspace. Now, the air traffic management system is aiming to cater to a wider area, often conflicting and varying demands from the large number of stakeholders, and those interdependencies are causing further complexity. One example is that while some departure procedure might not be most efficient when it comes to CO2 reduction, it is efficient when it comes to noise abatement. Another example is that while we can produce more capacity, that would increase the cost. So all these aspects and interdependency were taken part of that study. By realizing CES and CESA improvements, potential is of 5.1% of CO2 reduction for intra-EU flights and additional 1.5% of non-EU flights. Further improvement could be realized through optimized routing. This is to favor more optimized routing, which is not necessarily the shortest routing, but taking benefits, for example, of headwinds, tailwinds versus headwinds. Now, the second, let's say, subcategory of air traffic management is outside the CESA. The similar initiatives as Single European Sky are currently pursued elsewhere, and they will contribute to further reduction. Then we are looking as a recent development in technology, and this is surveillance over Atlantic Ocean. So in the past, there were no technology to provide surveillance, and the aircrafts could not be as tightly packed as today. Now, with the introduction of satellite-based surveillance, which is coming to be mandatory from January this year in States and then later on in Europe, we will be able to produce more efficiency. And one which is coming a little bit as a future, which is wake energy retrieval, also known as extended information flight. However, this concept is not yet mature and requires substantial work. Also, it will require substantial involvement of approval process by the regulators. And the last category, ground operations at the airports, is associated to movement with the weight and runway. One is reducing taxi emission, which include reduced engine taxi and potential towing by using tractor powered by biofuels or electricity. However, operational towing is certified only for use on some of the aircrafts, and it's still some research to be done how that can be implemented to the larger scale of the aircraft. And the last one subcategory of the ground operation at airports is reduced auxiliary power unit usage by relying on electrical ground power from fixed sources. These are the aspects that we identified potential reduction in CO2, but for this to happen, we need something. So if we can move to the next slide. First one, policies and action needed is release of the single European sky. And what that means, it is network-centric and digital European ATN system. It's the system which enables not one NSP or one airline or one particular airport, but what is the best for the system. Then we need research and development for that, support this, and coming with a new technology and other related CO2 reduction potential for the fuel and CO2 optimized route. The second category is speed up innovation in communication, navigation, and surveillance. As I mentioned earlier on, with the new technology, like it's now surveillance, satellite surveillance over oceanic areas, we will be able to do more. Reduced emission from aircraft taxi and APU usage. Again, we need a policy to benefit, to incentivize use of this technology. And last one is enable electrification and other alternative energy source like hydrogen, including infrastructure provision. Again, to be able to deliver all these improvements, we need policies incentivizing early adopters, incentivizing network-centric approach, and we can't do that alone unless we have a policy in place to enable us. Thank you, Jennifer.
Thanks very much, Tanya, for your presentation. And I'd now like to pass the floor to my boss, Thomas Reynard, the Managing Director of Airlines for Europe, to present the next pillar on sustainable aviation fuels. Thomas, the floor is yours.
To you all, if you could slide already in front of us. Just building on the wonderful pie chart that Vincent and Tanya started to construct, I'm putting another piece to it with sustainable aviation fuels, or the role that sustainable aviation fuels could make. And as you can see here, it is really huge. It is a huge chunk and a very important chunk of the road to decarbonisation for aviation. So now you realize why SAF's sustainable aviation fuels are such a hot issue in the Brussels corridors, but also at national level. So it counts for no less than 34% in our model for the reduction of CO2. But an additional, as also Elizabeth alluded to earlier, there is the impact, the effect of price of sustainable aviation fuels, in this case, on demand. So that adds another 12% reduction. We can go to the next slide, please. As many of you know, SAFs have the potential to account for about 83% of the total fuel consumption in Europe by 2050. With the use of sustainable aviation fuels, net CO2 emissions over the entire life cycle can be reduced up to 80% today and up to 100% in the future. So that's really, really encouraging. However, there's always a but. As you might have guessed, we see three main challenges in order to get there. One related to the economic viability of sustainable aviation fuels, another one to the sustainability, how sustainable are these aviation fuels or sustainable aviation fuels, and then last but not least, of course, the issue of the supply potential of sustainable aviation fuels. Let me just elaborate a little bit on those three challenges. First of all, the economic viability. There's a clear need to scale up and commercialize SAFs. That remains one of the key challenges, as SAFs today cost about 2 to 7 times the price of fossil fuels. The main economic barriers are related to the higher cost compared to fossil kerosene today, and the investment risk also associated with this new market. So we have to consider the different types of incentives to bridge the price gap with fossil fuels. Second, sustainability. It has to be clear that only advanced biofuels and synthetic fuels based on the EU Renewable Energy Directive should be considered here. This is a very important point. Destination 2050 foresees the integration of these low carbon fuels, but only those which are truly sustainable and without any compromise, i.e. when it comes to deforestation or food supplies, for instance. Then thirdly, the challenge of the supply. European SAF production is of course seen as an integral part, a full part of Europe's energy transition towards full decarbonisation, but also towards energy independence, I think, which is also a topic which we shouldn't forget looking at the European energy scene or energy supply scene. The majority of the production capacity for SAFs is assumed to be built in Europe based on locally resourced feedstocks. And of course, new feedstocks and production processes, they need to be developed to increase the feedstock space and ensure the supply. So with that, I think we can go to the next slide. So as my colleagues before have actually elaborated on the plans and the wonderful things that are out there, but as always, I also have this slide for you. So what does this mean in terms of policies and actions that we need, including from governments, in order to get there? I won't go into the detail of this slide. You have all the details on the slide, but basically what it comes down to is the fact that a long-term policy framework is needed to de-risk industry investments, as I mentioned before, but also to boost the production and the uptake of SAFs in Europe. So defining a coherent long-term policy framework and at the same time addressing the supply and the economic challenges through financial and regulatory measures should be carried out today. In the longer term, renewable energy production in the EU should be increased and sustainable feedstocks should be allocated between the sectors based on the technological alternatives to fossil fuels. And I say this, I really want to stress this, because as you probably realize is that unlike other industries, aviation, unfortunately, does not have an immediate alternative to fossil fuels. But here we have a roadmap to actually achieve net zero emissions by 2050 with the help of SAFs as well. Actively driving a European SAF industrial policy would create thousands of clean jobs, growth, and really position us in the center of the global aviation decarbonization effort. Also an important fact of growth, and the fact that we can export this knowledge towards outside of Europe, which was mentioned by Vincent as well. I would like to keep it here and looking forward to your questions later on. Over to you, Jennifer. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Thomas. And once again, I just remind journalists on the call to please write your questions in the Q&A, and we will be getting to those questions shortly. I'll now pass the floor to our final speaker, speaker for today, Olivier Jankovic. Olivier is the Director General at Airports Council International Europe, ACI Europe. Olivier, it's a pleasure to pass the floor to you now. Thanks.
Thank you, Jennifer, and good morning to all. Thank you again for joining us for this important announcement this morning. I'm adding the final piece to the chart outlined already by my colleagues earlier, looking at how economic measures can close the gap for us to reach net zero by 2050. As you can see here, we see economic measures playing an important role, delivering 10% reduction of the reduction in CO2 emissions we need to make. Out of these 10%, 2% come from the impact of these economic measures on demand through higher prices for 2%. Next slide, please. We see the role of economic measures more in the short term as a key tool really to reduce emissions. Why? Because of course that measures assign a price to CO2 emissions, ensuring that airlines take climate cost explicitly into account in their business decisions. And that means that this accelerates the energy transition, and crucially, this allows to bridge the gap until the breakthrough technologies outlined by Vincent and the sustainable aviation fuels outlined by Thomas can become more widely available. To be effective, these economics measures needs to be market-based, and we have them already today. We have the EU emission trading schemes, and we have the carbon offsetting schemes of CORSIA. In principle, of course, we favor global market-based measures because they have the largest emission reduction potential, together with the most cost efficiency. And crucially, also, they prevent market distortion and carbon leakage, which is very important for a sector as international as aviation. Of course, we don't know yet how CORSIA and the EU ETS will develop and coexist in the future. So for this report, we had to make some assumptions. And the assumptions we have been making are the following. For intra-European routes, we see a continuation of the EU ETS, but a tightened and reinforced EU ETS aligned with the net zero goal. For routes between the EU and external markets, we see a revamped CORSIA as of 2035. That means a CORSIA that is also aligned with a net zero 2050 goal for international routes. The combination of this, we believe, will drive the price of EU ETS allowances and carbon credits upwards, and it will lead to more scarcity in the availability of allowances and carbon credits, which means that by 2050, the only allowances and carbon credits available would be carbon removal projects, which allows us to achieve net zero CO2 emissions. Next slides, please. So the result of these assumptions is that we see economic measures really key to reduce CO2 emissions over the short term, in particular until 2030. We see that by then, these will account for 27% of the reduction in CO2 emissions, 55 million tons. And from there on, beyond 2030, we will decrease the reliance on economic measures as the breakthrough technologies and the sustainable aviation fuels become more widely available. And that's why by 2050, as I mentioned earlier, economic measures will account for 8% of the reduction in CO2 emissions from the sector. Next slide, please. So in terms of the policies and the actions needed to allow us to deliver on this roadmap based on those assumptions, clearly it's very important that the EU continues to advocate for an ambitious global mechanism in line with the net zero ambitions. And that means, again, a revamped and upgraded CORSIA. ICAO is now working on the long-term goal that is under definition, and that should be the foundation for this revamped and more ambitious CORSIA moving forward. Until such global measure is available, it is of course important to keep strengthening the EU ETS, as I mentioned earlier, to make it fully aligned with the new EU climate goals. We also need higher standards for CORSIA offset credits, and we need EU member states to invest all revenues from auctioned ETS aviation allowances into the sector's decarbonisation. This is especially important in the context of a reduction of free allocation. And finally, of course, we need to find a way to avoid double counting of emissions between the EU ETS and CORSIA. And that completes my presentation on that pillar. Over to you, Jennifer.
Thanks very much, Olivier. And perhaps you'd like to give some closing remarks to close things up before we head into the Q&A.
Thank you, Jennifer. So I think together with my colleagues today, what we're doing, we're delivering a vision to make our commitment to net zero for European aviation by 2050 a reality, with a detailed roadmap and pathways in terms of how we can achieve those CO2 reductions. And in particular, we are announcing some very important, I think, groundbreaking commitments that you can see here. Reaching net zero CO2 emissions by 2050 for all flights within and departing from the EU, reducing net CO2 emissions from those flights by 45% by 2030 compared to the baseline, and finally assessing the feasibility of making 2019 the peak year for absolute CO2 emission for these flights. So by doing this and with this commitment, we think it's very clear that we as a sector are aligning now with the EU climate goals, and that we are showing that we not only want to be part of the solution, but that we think we can be part of the solution, so that indeed we can chart a future where air connectivity and bringing people together across borders and across cultures remains an essential staples of our society. However, and we can go to the next slides, this is clearly something that we cannot do on our own. Even more so now with the unprecedented crisis we are going through. I think it's very clear when you read the report that the magnitude and the complexity of the challenge we face, and the fact that indeed there's no magic wand, every single part of the pillars we've outlined counts. All this means that we need intense collaboration and alignment. Collaboration and alignment within the industry, of course, first, and I think this is what we are actually delivering today with this report, but also crucially, collaboration and alignment with policymakers and regulators. Again, with this kind of challenge, it's very clear that it will take more than two to tango. So clearly today, we think that with this report, the ball is now with the EU and the member states. We expect them to embrace our vision and this roadmap, and that means that we need them to come up with an enabling and supporting regulatory and financial framework that will provide us with the policy and legal certainty allowing us to work on this. To secure this alignment with the EU and member states, we need to find a new way of working together, a new way of moving forward relationship between industry and policymakers. And that's exactly the idea of our EU Pact for Sustainable Aviation. It is up now to the European Commission and to the member states to embrace the concept of that pact and to drive it forward with us. And that means that through that pact, we should be agreeing and formalizing joint targets, agreeing and formalizing joint roadmaps, with two roadmaps clearly, the industry roadmap, which is what we are proposing today, and in correspondence to that, the policy and regulatory roadmap that we need. I think we have no time to lose. The challenge is daunting. This is why we need to get this pact running this year. And this is the appeal we're sending today to the European Commission and to member states. Very final remark, I'd like to thank NLR and CO for their work, for their expertise, for challenging us many times along those past months. But those challenges were worth the result, so thank you for that. And I'll close here. Thank you, Jen. Over to you.
Thanks very much indeed, Olivier, for your closing remarks. And we do have a bunch of questions in the Q&A, so I'll get right started. The first question is from Victoria Moores at Air Transport World, and her question is for Elizabeth and Vincent. It's related to the chapter on hydrogen. The question is related to the fact that hydrogen will be included as part of the roadmap at a later stage. And if you could give a bit more details as far as what the difference that makes, the fact that hydrogen will be introduced later on in 2030 and beyond, what difference that made in the percentages and the conclusions. Maybe first Elizabeth and then Vincent can add some further details. Thanks.
Thank you, Jennifer. So indeed, I think hydrogen is a very important enabler for reaching net zero CO2 emissions in 2050, specifically for flights within Europe. As you have seen, we have modeled the hydrogen aircraft in the single aisle category, starting with an entry into service in 2035 for flights up to 165 passengers below 2,000 kilometers. So these are all the flights within Europe. And as you will see in the graph, specifically for intra-European flights, they take up a huge chunk of the CO2 emission reductions. So absolutely, these aircrafts, we see them as an essential element in reaching the net zero targets, and therefore we will also, pleased to see that this interest in hydrogen is not only from an aviation perspective, but that the Commission launched this hydrogen strategy enabling a hydrogen economy, thereby making it more realistic as other sectors of the economy will be using this infrastructure and this renewable hydrogen as well. I would like now to give the floor to Vincent, maybe to add some additional insights on this.
Yes, thank you. Yes, of course, this is one of the elements I mentioned as the technology strategy. It's today in the research and innovation phase. So it's one of the elements part of the Clean Aviation program. Of course, as I said before, these aircraft can fly and be bought by airlines. They need to be researched and then need to be certified. And that's why hydrogen comes in later, along with the other pillars, which I mentioned, was like the hybrid electric aircraft, but also the adaptation of existing aircraft for 100% SAF usage.
Okay, thanks very much, Vincent. The next question is from Andreas Schultz. It's a question, I believe, for Kanzo, and it's related to the CO2 emission savings from implementing the single European sky have been known for decades. In fact, it's well over 20 years by my count. And the question is indeed whether we think that now is the chance for a breakthrough on the single European sky. Maybe we can start with Tanya for this question.
Thank you very much, Jennifer, and to the question. Well, the envisioned savings of 5%, let's say, until 2030, and then 6% until 2025. Just to correct, because in the question is mentioned 12%. Yes, I believe we have a breakthrough. First of all, there is a commitment from these 5 associations to drive the agenda. And as Olivier mentioned at the end of his presentation, there is a pact between us to deliver. So whole idea is to enable us to move to a situation in which airspace boundaries and national sovereignty considerations are respected, but not longer negatively impact the ATM environment performance. So this is possible. Would I use word breakthrough? I don't, it's not that nothing has been done until today. There are many initiatives of cross-border provision, of delegation of the airspace already, but it's done between 2 states or 3 states agreement, not necessarily as a global network, as a European network centric. So yes, I do believe we are on the critical point. We are committed to deliver together to work with the states to make sure that they feel that their sovereignty is respected, but also that we deliver this this new vision of the CES. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Tanya. The next question comes from Chris Sturgeon from Green Online. Chris is asking whether, in fact, we plan to report on the results from this roadmap, on the progress of the roadmap, and he's also asking whether we believe that, sorry, just give me 1 second. Maybe we can start with the first part of the question because there's a lot in there. Thomas, is there a plan to report back on the progress of this, or how do you foresee progress, the way forward in terms of progress being achieved?
Thanks for the question, Jennifer. Yes, indeed. I mean, the first milestone, of course, is to what we're doing now to launch it, and then reach out in very concrete terms to the policymakers with focus on the European Commission. So as we speak, we are setting up actually conversations, discussions with the European Commission, with the relevant services at the highest level with the European Commission, where we first of all would need to have their feedback on, you know, on the one hand, these are our commitments, and then from their perspective, how are you going to meet this partnership? I'd like to refer to the partnership we referred to in the Aviation Roundtable report at the end of last year. So we're very serious about the partnership. So without the partnership with government, be it EU level, at national level, because for some, to get some of these things done, actually a lot, we need the support at local level as well. So that's first. So we will need to assess with all the some of the policies and the actions that are already in the pipeline under the Green Deal. We need to assess first as a group what the reaction of the governments and the European Commission is on that. And of course, I mean, we and I think all of us, we are looking at 2030 and 2050. These are the two main targets we're looking at. And it is a project which is starting now. I mean, the formal project of outreach and regular assessment. I think maybe also to add on that, you also have to realize that there are a huge number of major organizations, companies behind this. So as associations, we represent, it's fair to say, the European civil aviation with this, which means that manufacturers, airlines, air navigation service providers and airports, that those companies and the airports and all those corporations are behind it as well. Many of those, of course, many of our members, if I can call it that, have already started as corporations. They have their own sustainability programs. This gives them, I think, an additional argument, justification to also go to their national governments and the Commission to lobby in line with what the 2050 says. So it's actually, in a way, a very complex process, which both is taken on board by the associations, by us, but of course will have a trigger on effect, a positive trigger on effect at the corporate level as well in Europe, and that is a constant process. But of course, I think we're all sort of, the obvious thing is to the pressure is on all of us now, looking at 2030 and 2050, and that's a constant debate.
Thanks, Thomas. And indeed, the second part of his question, Chris's question, was which measures do we consider to be the most challenging to achieve in this report to reach our 2050 target, and how reliant are we on the EU and government policies to reach this target? I don't know, Tom, if you have anything else to add, and then maybe we can pass the floor to any of the other heads of association to comment.
I think, I mean, I'd like to be brief on that and give my colleagues also an opportunity to comment. I think the percentages on terms of potential and the opportunities are clear from our wonderful pie chart, which is showed now. It also comes at a cost. I mean, there's also the impact on demand, which is what she has mentioned several times. I think it's all going to be, some of these can be done shorter term. If you think about in the ATM space, there are most of the technologies are available today. I think, as Tanya also alluded to, I think SAFs is obviously, and technologies, the new technologies Vincent talked about, are going to be, I mean, there are major challenges. So we need to have the funding and the right regulatory framework in place. It's not just going to happen overnight. But with the roadmap, we are really committing ourselves to literally this roadmap, which is, so the pressure is clearly on us, but also on government. And I think they're all equally important. All the 4 pillars are important. We cannot say we're just going to do, you know, number 1 and number 2. No, we need to today. We are committed to forcing through with the work that needs to be done in the 4 pillars. They are interrelated. It's not just pick and choose. We need to do all 4 of them.
Maybe I can add, so we are indeed committed from the industry, and if you talk about technology, the research and innovation is very important. So industry is co-funding its part of research and innovation. We need, of course, national authorities and the European Commission to also take its share of commitments and make sure public funding is available for research and innovation. We have important decisions coming up on the funding for the Clean Aviation Program, the CESAR 2020 program. They need to be prioritized within the Commission so that we have the tools to achieve those goals. If we don't get the funding from the authorities to co-fund, of course, this will have an impact on what we can do. The same is for national governments. We have the national recovery plans now as part of Next Generation EU. This is an opportunity also for all national governments to prioritize aviation in terms of research, but also in terms of SAFs, in terms of infrastructure for funding or fleet renewal, for example. So we need really all the national authorities and the European Union to take its part of commitment in terms of funding. It's really now that decisions have to be taken. If we do that together, because we are committed, we can achieve the goals. But if one of both is not fulfilling its commitment, it will of course have an impact.
Just if I may add also a last point, I think what this report shows is that all parts of the aviation sector are ready to disrupt the way they work, are ready to disrupt their business model to take on the challenge of decarbonization. I think equally, we need policymakers and regulators to rethink the way they work on this and rethink the way they work with industry on this, because what we're seeing for now is that they're not necessarily aligned at national level, aligned between the national level and the EU level. And there's dispersion, inefficiencies, and I don't think we will reach our goal if that policy and regulatory misalignment continues. So I think with the pact that we're proposing, it's a way of bringing everybody on the industry side and on the policy side at all levels, national and EU, fully aligned towards the same objective so that we can work more efficiently on this.
Thanks, Olivier. If I'll move on to the next question, because there are indeed a few more to get to. We had a question from Tom at Business Traveler, Tom Otley, just for clarification vis-a-vis the impact of SAFs on demand. And his question is that for Thomas, whether in fact this means that the cost of SAFs would be passed on to consumers, thereby suppressing demand and then leading to higher ticket prices. Maybe Thomas, you can say a word on that. Thanks.
Okay, and if Elizabeth wants to jump in, that would be fine too. I think it's clear that most of the measures that we have presented will have an impact, according to the report, on demand. How much of that is, of course, at the end of the day, these are predictions. It's difficult to say. It also has to do with, of course, market developments, including, for instance, how the market will evolve after COVID-19, which is a different issue, but it's still going to determine the market situation. So yes, I mean, it is fair to say that there will be an impact on demand. I don't know whether, Elizabeth, you wanted to add maybe a little bit on that.
Yes, thank you, Thomas. So indeed, there is a full pass-through assumed in the modeling on passengers, and thereby that will impact demand, because some passengers may refrain from traveling and some passengers may choose to use other modes of transport. And the impact is basically by looking at the price difference between fossil fuels and sustainable aviation fuels. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Elizabeth. The next question is from Peggy Hollinger from the Financial Times. Peggy's question is first for Vincent. She says, you mentioned that the industry needs support for research and development, but it will also have to invest itself. Do you have an estimate for how much needs to be invested in total by the industry to achieve this roadmap? And secondly, the question is for A4E, whether we have factored in hydrogen aircraft by 2035, but knowing that, of course, hydrogen aircraft will not be widely used by 2035, vis-a-vis fleet renewal, that will take time. Maybe that's a question that we can turn to Elizabeth to reflect on, and then Thomas, if he has anything further to add. Just to finish the question from Peggy, she asks if this aircraft, if hydrogen aircraft will not be widely used, and it's likely to be limited in range and capacity even by 2050, are we being too optimistic to include hydrogen-powered aircraft as part of this plan? And isn't it more realistic to see hydrogen as an enabler for emissions-free SAF rather than as a fuel for aviation? So for this one, maybe let's start with Vincent, Elizabeth, and then of course Olivier or any of the others. If you have something to add, please go ahead, Elizabeth.
So I can start. Maybe I can, of course, answer in terms of investments the question about what happens at European level in terms of research. So yes, the industry is committed, for example, to the Clean Aviation program, which is going to be launched as a follow-up of the existing Clean Sky program. In terms of research funding, so the industry is going to put a little bit above 5 billion euros in research funding over the total program, which means it needs to be matched by the Commission from the Horizon Europe budgets. And that was what I was mentioning. The Horizon Europe has now been adopted in terms of overall budget envelopes, but we need Clean Aviation and also CESAR to be prioritized in terms of getting part of these funds. We are willing to put over 5 billion, but the Commission also needs to put its part. In terms of what individual companies later on will have to invest once we go into industrialization, of course, that's a question for later on. You have to ask individual companies because they won't share that between competitors, as you understand. But of course, this will also require substantial investments later on. But now we need to do the research so that we are ready for the technology to be deployed later on.
Elizabeth, I don't know if there's anything else you can add on the use of hydrogen in the report. Yeah.
Yes, so indeed, we model the CO2 emission reduction potential through fleet renewal. So, you know, and all the aircraft being changed with a newer successor. And that also holds for the hydrogen aircraft in a single aisle. So at aircraft level, CO2 emission reductions are up to 100%. But then obviously it takes time for these aircraft to enter the fleet. So by 2050, about 2/3 of the aircraft which fly on routes below 2,000 kilometers and within Europe will be replaced by hydrogen aircraft. So the full potential realized in 2050 is 67% emission reductions at fleet level. So indeed, we have taken into account that it takes time for these emission reductions to materialize by fleet replacement. And well, indeed, you need renewable energy to produce hydrogen. And any additional energy that then would be available for the use of sustainable aviation fuels. And that's also the way we modeled it in the report. So we looked from the European Hydrogen Strategy and other sources, literature sources, okay, how much renewable hydrogen do we expect is available in this year? And then a portion will go to the hydrogen aircraft and a portion will go to power to liquid fuels.
Thanks very much, Elizabeth. We'll move on to the next question. I'll open this one to the floor. Does this roadmap account for or seek to address the non-CO2 effects of aviation on climate change? This is a question from Simon Pickstone for ENDS Europe. Maybe Elizabeth, would you like to answer this? Thank you.
So indeed, in our report, we have a section in which we talk about the non-CO2 climate impacts because we acknowledge that these indeed are present and exist. We believe future work is necessary to include these non-CO2 impacts into the roadmap. And especially also from a regulatory perspective, it needs to be more clear how these will be taken into account in the future. There, where possible, we did mention in the roadmap if additional benefits from the technologies we analyzed were also present in terms of non-CO2 climate impact. So think about synthetic fuels having lower fine particle emissions, or for example, hydrogen aircraft having potentially lower NOx emissions. So whenever possible, we did address it in a qualitative way in the report.
Thanks, Elizabeth. The next question comes from Frank Hutten from the Deutsche Verkehrszeitung. The question is, how can market measures themselves cut emissions by 8%? They set a price itself. Does the price itself cut emissions? Question for Olivier. Thanks. Olivier, do you hear me?
Yes, sorry.
Did you hear the question?
No,
yes,
I didn't hear the last part of the question. If you mind, do you mind repeating it?
Sure. The question is a question from Frank Hutten from the Deutsche Verkehrszeitung related to market measures. How can market measures themselves cut emissions by 8%? They set a price which maybe they set a price which maybe makes new technology and SAF more interesting, and they reduce demand. But how does the price itself cut emissions? I think it's more a question about clarifying market-based measures and the role they play in the report. Elizabeth, if you have something to add.
Yeah, I think market measures, if you look at EU ETS, the basic principle is you buy allowances that are capped. So if the cap is well defined, then you achieve a reduction, of course. And we know that there will be a reform of the EU ETS system where probably free allowances won't be available as well. So that means that the prices of the allowances will go up. At the same time, the availability of the allowances will go down. So all this is driving up price together with a reduction in emissions. Again, if the cap is well defined. When it comes to CORSIA, it's a bit different because the money goes into offset projects. So achieving reductions to that depends very much on the quality of the offset credits and a very robust accounting methods. And this is one of our policy asks actually in this report, is that when we look at CORSIA, the global system, we need the quality of the offsets to be really addressed to make sure that we can deliver on effective reductions. I don't know if Elizabeth wants to add anything.
Thank you, Olivier. Well, indeed, I'd like to stress that for 2050, the assumption that we made in the report is that for each ton of CO2 emissions, a carbon allowance needs to be bought, which actually ensures that that emission is removed from the atmosphere. So then the money should really go to ensuring that this ton of carbon is removed from the atmosphere, either by natural sinks or by dedicated technologies. And indeed, as you can see in the report, there are assumptions on how the money spent on these allowances should be used to ensure that it really causes a reduction in emissions, whether it is within EU ETS, as explained by Olivier, or within a global system like CORSIA.
Thanks, Elizabeth, for that. The next question is a follow-up question from Andreas, perhaps from Montserrat. He's asking about the ability for regional airlines. Regional airlines suffer hard at the moment, and the debt burden will mount for the years to come. So how can the new CO2 savings technologies that new aircraft will bring, how can these be financed? Montserrat.
Thank you. Yes, yes, you're absolutely right, and we do need the manufacturers to develop the technology further and provide much better technology, even with hydrogen and electric aircraft and hybrid. So the airlines will be ready to invest in the right technology when it's available. I think the smaller operators will clearly be the ground for testing the new technologies, and the flagship, and also the first one to do the commercial flights on electric and hybrid electric. You're absolutely right. Increasing public funding, co-funding, civil aviation, research and innovation, and it's absolutely key to encourage fleet renewal. So therefore, things like green stimulus for fleet renewal are also important. We do need efficient aircraft in the skies.
Okay. And Montserrat, maybe one follow-up question while we have you. It's a question regarding SAF uptake, and indeed, the question is from Glenn Sands from Lara magazine. He says, it's a great report regarding SAF. It's the bigger airlines that have so far led the way. So how do the regional airlines, again, how will they manage additional SAF uptake and the additional costs?
We are ensuring or encouraging more production of sustainable aviation fuels to be able to drive the prices down, and even encouraging a mandate on the supply, and therefore be able to afford and to use SAFs more and more.
Okay, we have just a little bit more time to get through the last questions. Sarah Wilkin says, do you plan to collaborate with organizations working on how to integrate sustainable travel into their carbon neutral plans? If so, how do you propose organizations reach out to us to do this? So it's a question more about next steps going forward. Indeed, it's the whole travel journey here needs to become more sustainable as the industry grows. Maybe Olivier, do you want to say a few words about this?
Yes, thank you, Jen. I think moving forward, of course, we're very open to collaborate with any other stakeholder, to make the achievement of our goals possible. I think, of course, what we have put on the table now is about aircraft emissions, and this is where we want to focus in the immediacy in the coming weeks, especially because the key issue for us is to get buy-in from the Commission and Member States for this Pact for Sustainable Aviation. But I think this report will continue to be a living document, as has been mentioned by Elizabeth in the introduction. There's a lot of uncertainties, a lot of things that we will keep working as technology develops, as new elements comes into place, and of course we'll be also willing to look at things like non-CO2 impacts, but also at widening the cooperation with also stakeholders across the travel industry and the tourism industry.
Thanks, Olivier. The next question is from Glenn Sands from Lara magazine. He's asking about our views on the applications of electric commercial aircraft, if they represent a practical solution for the industry on regional routes. Elizabeth, maybe you can say a few words if electric was considered as part of this report, and then of course, Vincent, if you would like to add on this as well.
So indeed, there's an analysis on hybrid electric aircraft in the report. This is mainly indeed for the shorter range flights and for a small amount of passengers, but it is an enabler to then develop these technologies further for larger aircraft. So despite that, very small aircraft under, for example, 20 seats may only represent a very small portion of CO2 emissions. They still can be an enabler to develop these technologies and then apply them to the larger categories of aircraft. So hybrid electric has been modeled in the regional segment for 2035.
Yeah, I can add to that. So indeed, it is for the smaller end. It's also, by the way, for rotorcraft, for helicopters, potential solution. Now, these technologies will, of course, evolve. We won't see a very large aircraft electric flying, But of course, when technologies mature, maybe they will find other applications. So it's also a reason why it's important to not only implement research programs for the low end of the market, but also to mature the knowledge on these technologies so that they can evolve.
Okay, just a few more minutes left. The next question is from Andrew Charlton. Andrew says, for years and years, aviation has downplayed its role in emissions, only 2%. Now you want huge amounts of funding to resolve what you say is a tiny part of the problem. How do you reconcile this? So I guess maybe we can start with Vincent if you want to say words about the funding aspects, and then of course I pass the floor to any of the other colleagues to weigh in as well. Thanks.
I think we never downplayed the need for action. We always have been serious, and I think it's important to bear in mind that the industry actually has a track record of reducing its emissions. Each generation of new aircraft typically reduces by 30% the emissions. Now, of course, because we are a growth industry, that means total emissions are increasing. But we have never downplayed it, and we need really to fully decarbonize by 2050 by working all these 4 pillars, and that's why we need really support from the regulators, from the national authorities, from the Commission, in a partnership approach. And we should acknowledge it's a challenging way ahead, but we can do it if we work together.
Okay, very good. I believe we have just a handful of questions left. Just trying to go through them now. The question is from Chloe Greenbank for Olivier and/or Thomas. Given SAF has an immediate impact in terms of reducing emissions, are airports and operators doing enough to communicate and promote SAF availability as a drop-in fuel for their customers? And if not, what should they be doing? So maybe, I don't know, Olivier, if you want to start, and Thomas, please feel free to add anything.
Yes, thank you, Jen. I think there's a lot of awareness with the SAF from the airport side as well, and we're mindful that we have also an important role to play in making sure that our facilities and infrastructure allows for SAF to be deployed also at airports. Of course, this is not something we can do also on our own. It depends also on a full range of suppliers. But you have actually airports who are taking today very active states to actually develop SAF production facilities or research into SAF. That's the case, for example, Schiphol Airport, who's very active in that field. So I think we're on our side, we're ready to play our part and to accompany the transformation and the SAF deployment.
Maybe I want to just add, it was mentioned already, but also from the manufacturers, we are ready to do our part on SAF. As I mentioned, all the future aircraft will be 100% SAF capable, as compared to today it's 50%. And that's also why, as I said, it's important that we continue working on improvements of fuel efficiency of existing aircraft, and not only work on hydrogen, which is of course important in an electric aircraft, but also on existing technology.
Yeah, if I could just add maybe, thanks Vincent and Olivier, to the question from an airline's perspective. I think if you know, looking at what's been published, I would say the last 12 to 24 months, I think it's quite clear that many airlines, leading airlines, including A4E members, have come forward with projects, with investments they're doing in all kinds of alternative fuels, including synthetic fuels. And I think they're also clearly communicating that to the passenger. It's true that the passenger today really wants to be informed about the degree of how green the flight is, and I think airlines really understood that very well. And so it's not only a question of communication, but also commitment that many of the major airlines actually have been making the last couple of years. There was an announcement earlier this week from another airline I will not mention, but it's quite clear that airlines have not sitted and waited for the governments to take action. They've already taken first steps together with suppliers of SAF to invest and to actually to test SAF in today's engines as well. So it is these initiatives have been going on for quite a while. What we are doing with this report is we are actually putting this into context of, I said, the other 3 pillars in order to reduce CO2 emissions by 2030 and 2050.
Okay, thanks, Thomas. Maybe time for just one or two last questions. The question is about a SAF blending mandate, and I think it's an important question from Kathy. She says, as A4E, you seem to support an EU-wide SAF blending mandate. What do you see as a reasonable percentage to start off with, and from when? And is ERA also supportive of a blending mandate? So indeed, a question about blending mandates in the context of this Destination 2050 report. Maybe we can start with Thomas and then Mansour.
Thanks very much for the question, Kathy. Very good question, blending mandate. From an A4E perspective, we are supportive of a blending mandate in principle, but I did point out earlier in the presentation the challenges we have. If you would be submitting or mandating a blending mandate too soon, I would say literally today, it could really have a major environmental and economic detrimental impact, because the conditions, as I said, not only the market but also the conditions for feedstock and so on is not there today. Now, having said that, yes, the European Commission is looking into this, which is very good. I think what we need to avoid is to have a divergent approach in terms of targets and policies with member states, which we're actually seeing as well in parallel. So I think, first of all, the timing is very important for a blending mandate. Secondly, the right conditions need to be in place. Remember, I told you about the importance of really talking about having a real sustainable feedstock. And I think also, so thirdly, let's not forget there are also other ways of promoting uptake of SAFs. There are, other ways of, if you look also at in other countries or countries outside of Europe, subsidies, offtake agreements, auction mechanisms, and capital grants. So the blending mandate is of course, in principle, a good idea, but I think there are clear conditions that we need to be aware of before they're actually being mandated.
Maybe I can add something from the manufacturer side. So we support also the mandates. It's an example where we believe that the policymakers needs to work together with us, with the industry, and they can not only provide support in terms of the mandate itself, but also support in terms of providing public funding, part of recovery programs from COVID, for example, to increase the production and uptake of these fuels. If the right policies are put in place, then of course more can be achieved, and that's, I think, important. Again, we need to work together and we need support from the policymakers.
Just to add on that, I think I agree with my colleagues. I think as a stable policy framework is absolutely necessary to achieve these, and therefore we welcome the EU Refuel Aviation initiative recently launched by the European Commission. We're not able to support or to come up with a figure on blending mandates for the airlines, because there's simply not enough supply. So unless the supply is ramped up really quickly, we cannot give a percentage. However, we do encourage to do one on supply, so therefore that would encourage for the production of SAFs.
Thanks, Monse. And the last question for today is from Eric Rene from the SWA. He says, who should build a plan on CESAR and the European Single Sky? Are we serious? And who will control the use of money from CORSIA and EU ETS? For the first question on if we're serious about building a plan on CESAR and the Single European Sky, maybe Tanya, just a few words from your side, and on CORSIA and EU ETS, maybe Thomas wants to weigh in, or Montserrat. Thanks.
Thank you, Eric. Well, when it comes to Single European Sky, the policymakers need to work with us, and we need to work with them. We need to ensure them that the changes will not affect their sovereignty issues, and that it's possible. When it comes to CESAR, Well, I think Vincent did elaborate on that a bit earlier. We are in this together. Let's not forget that part of the CSR is industry. So we do have an airline representatives there. We have industry from manufacturers representatives, also from air navigation service providers. So we are in it together, but also our partners, EU needs to work with us to enable us this research to deliver these solutions. Thank you.
Yeah, I can add from the manufacturers on the ATM side. It's again an example where we need support from policymakers. So the plan is there. We are going to move towards a digital air traffic management system in the future. We now have, because of COVID, low traffic levels. So it's an opportunity maybe to even accelerate implementation of some or trial of some of these new concepts. But again, because of the situation of the industry here, the air navigation service providers, of course, have also lacking money because of COVID. If we can get public funding from recovery funds, we could do things quicker here. And the plan could maybe be implemented quicker, but the plan is there and the manufacturing industry is working on all these solutions. They should be deployed.
Thanks very much, Vincent. Well, we're almost out of time. If there are no further questions, or if you've asked a question in the Q&A and I haven't had time to get to it, please feel free to email us and we will respond to you bilaterally. Thanks to all our viewers watching via the live stream. It's a great day for us and we're happy you could join us and participate and be part of it. So have a great day and we will speak with you all very soon. Just one last word, we will be having a policy event on the 25th of February with a number of leaders from the industry and from the EU side, EU officials. So please be on the lookout for an invitation and we hope to see you on the 25th at the next event. Thanks very much and bye-bye.